The challenges of housing and community. I'm just going to broaden our discussion. But in the 70s, in terms of housing, there was a number of things that were significant, not just the development of housing, but the whole concept of mixing communities, in terms of mixed income communities. We also looked at the whole capacity building in terms of neighborhood improvement. We were talking about a number of things, so it was a broadening out, and people were engaged in the community. So what started happening in the 80s was there was a move away from the whole concept of income mixing, of capacity building, and we started to work towards housing that was focused in terms of non-income mix. There was a whole notion of we couldn't put public dollars into anything except serving the most needy. So with the exception of the co-op program, basically we looked at housing that was very, very focused in terms of people with specific problems, with specific issues. And I think that was the beginning of NIMBYism, because all of a sudden people who needed housing, who had specific issues, became identified, and it gave an opportunity for people to say, not in my backyard, you know, in terms of that particular focus. And we talked about this before, that in 1993, the federal programs were terminated. But I think as significant as that was the whole social union thing that happened in the late 90s, without consultation, just amongst the provinces and the feds, which actually devolved the responsibility in terms of housing and funding to the provinces, which made it more difficult in terms of people looking at a national housing program, in terms of the federal government being engaged with Canadians. They still are engaged with Canadians in terms of mortgage insurance, but not in terms of program delivery. And the other thing that happened in the late 90s was the emergence of homelessness as a major issue. And so what did we have? We had two particular things. We had the whole concept of the need for affordable housing that emerged. And in terms of the response, people were looking at developing units. I mean, numbers were a big issue in terms of government funding. It was the biggest bang for the buck. And I know what happened here in Alberta was a lot of money went into sort of private sector developments that were less expensive than the nonprofits. And a lot of those private sector developments have been sold or on the chopping block to be sold. And the other thing was we've got to deliver the most units in the quickest time. And that was one of the reasons for sort of focusing in on the private rather than the nonprofit sector. In terms of homelessness, the response was, let's get people off the street, let's get them out of the shelters. So we do whatever we can as quickly as possible, not thinking in terms of the context that we're looking at. So what did we lose in terms of that process? We lost a sense of community in terms of how we deliver housing. It was no longer housing in a context, it was housing that was just a roof over one's head. And I like this definition of community, which comes from the Circles of Learning, which is a nonprofit daycare provider in Illinois. But what they say is, and they focus it on children, the importance of community for children, and I think it covers all of us. But being involved in a community of family, friends, relations, and neighbors is important in the growth and development of your child. Community gives a child support, a sense of belonging, a strong sense of self, and a sense of connection. They feel emotionally and physically safe and valued. They develop social abilities and have a sense of sharing and caring for each other. Without being a part of a community, a child soon feels isolated, alone, has a feeling of unworthiness, and feels like a failure and starved of love. And just in terms of, I mean, that goes towards everybody. So, the other thing that I think is important in terms of what we need to look at is people need a sense of security of tenure and a sense of security of place. And the decision to move should be one of choice. And most, middle-income people, people of high incomes, their decision is based on choice. Unfortunately, in a lot of circumstances, and this comes out of our the way we deliver the housing programs now, we set income targets. And in a lot of cases in the program, if your income exceeds that, then you're out. So you have no security of tenure, you have no security of place. And in some instances, there's a lot of economic eviction. And Jay, you talked about the people in core need in terms of paying 50% of their income. And one of the things that I was looking at recently was the sort of turnover rate in tenancies. And unfortunately, Calgary keeps better statistics than Edmonton in terms of that. But generally, the turnover rate is somewhere around 30–35%. But one of the things I noted, and there was in the last study that I was able to access that was done, which is in 2009, there are a number of neighborhoods where there had a high number of renters, and the reasons for the turnover was eviction, financial, and then the third was maybe change of job or moving to some circumstances, and these rates were well over 40% in a lot of these neighborhoods. So what we've got is people sort of losing their home as a result of not being able to pay for it or whatever. The other thing I think that's important is to create an environment where residents can be engaged and empowered regardless of their tenure, whether they own or not. And if you look at a lot of the housing that we've provided in terms of affordable housing, we don't encourage people to be, number one, engaged with their immediate environment, like planting flowers, planting a garden. We don't necessarily allow them to be engaged in the management or operations or create sort of local support groups, mom's morning groups, kids, teens groups and whatever. And we don't usually create an opportunity for people to become engaged in their communities and their community leagues. And that's, I think, the kind of thing we have to think beyond just the roof over one's head. So I think what we need to do is we really need to take a step back. I know there are issues and we need to look at a spectrum in terms of housing solutions, but we really need to say, okay, if we move to the future, what is it that we should be looking at? And in terms of not just saying units, not just saying shelters, but talking about a range of things. And of course, in terms of defining housing, we have to look at physical adequacy, just in terms of the structure, in terms of standard housing, but also in terms of the environmental footprint, because we're dealing not just in terms of today, but we're dealing in terms of the future with regard to the whole impact in terms of the environment. I think the other thing we have to look at is the operating costs of that housing over time, because it's fine if you have housing, and this is interesting in terms of some of the capital cost subsidies that were provided under the last, if you will, tranche of funding, that it worked in day one, but as the operating costs go up over time, it doesn't necessarily work in the future because the gap grows greater. Obviously, we have to look at affordability, and there's a range in terms of definition of affordability. And in the old programs, in the 70s, we set an income percentage in terms of what people would pay. In today's sort of delivery, it's based upon a percentage of market. But what we really need to look at is how can we develop programs that really meet the needs of individual households along that income spectrum. I talked about the fact of security of tenure and security of place, and those are distinct concepts. I mean, one can have security of tenure in terms of a tenant, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have the capacity to decide where you want to live. Community instability, and then engagement and empowerment. So we need a broader matrix when we're looking at how we define housing. And I'm just going to leave you with this quote from Gaston Bachelard, from the Poetics of Space, and I couldn't believe it when I was looking at the thing. It was 60 years ago today that this work was translated into English. And he has a broader range of housing, but he says, I should say, the house shelters daydreaming, the house protects the dreamer, the house allows one to dream in peace. So I think we need to sort of broaden our horizons as we move forward. So that's my little comment.
I can feel the room bubbling over with desire to start interacting. We have about a half an hour break now. In the room directly behind you, down the short hallway, there are some information displays from organizations that are involved. You may want to go back and explore there. We've got 8 presenters that have challenged and educated you in the room. You may want to gather around one or another of them and raise questions or interact and converse a bit. There's snacks at the back. But we do need to have everybody back and ready to carry on at 11:10. I'd also like to ask the people that are going to be facilitators for the table work in that last hour, could you be up here at the front to meet with me at 11 o'clock, just to make sure we're all on the same page for what will be happening when we come back at 11:10. So thank you for your soaking up for these last 2 hours, and we'll give you 30 minutes to stretch and engage.